Imagine a headline that never needed to exist. No invasion footage, no emergency speeches, no breaking news countdown. Just a quiet shift, noticed only by analysts, and understood too late by everyone else. Tonight's story is not about what will happen. It is about what would happen if America ever decided to move on Greenland. The American relationship with Greenland is one of the strangest geopolitical arrangements on the planet. It is not an occupation, not a colony, and technically, not even an alliance between equals, given Greenland's status as an autonomous region within the Kingdom of Denmark. Yet, the military footprint, the strategic necessity, and the sheer amount of American investment there are so vast that it creates a kind of permanent, frictionless strategic tension that exists even in peacetime. The history here is crucial because it established the precedent for America's effective control, long before the modern era. Back in the early 1940s, with Nazi Germany occupying Denmark, the fate of Greenland hung in the balance. The island was strategically vital, a massive, unsinkable aircraft carrier sitting squarely in the North Atlantic Gap. Recognizing this, the U.S. essentially stepped in. In April 1941, the American-Danish Agreement on the Defense of Greenland was signed. This agreement effectively transferred military authority over the island to the United States for the duration of the conflict, allowing the U.S. Army to establish bases, most notably the crucial airbase at Bluie West 1, now known as Narsarsuaq. When the war ended, American forces were expected to leave. Most did, but the strategic value of the island only increased with the dawn of the Cold War. As the Soviet Union rose as the primary global threat, Greenland became the forward listening post, the northern shield protecting the entire North American continent. This led to the 1951 defense agreement between Denmark and the United States, which cemented the American presence, most famously at Thule Air Base, now the site of Pitchafik Space Base. This base is not just a strategic outpost. It is the northernmost installation of the U.S. military. It's a critical component of the ballistic missile early warning system, watching for launches over the Arctic. This brings us to the present scenario. If America were to solidify its claim or absorb control over Greenland entirely, the first thing people expect is movement, ships, troops, announcements. But that's not how this would begin. Because America is already there. The bases are built. The airspace is monitored. The radar is active. So the first step would look exactly like yesterday. That is the entire point. Most conflicts have a moment. A line crossed, a vote taken, a missile launched. Greenland would not. Instead, there would be a new agreement quietly expanded. Perhaps a logistical adjustment, a security update framed as routine. No speeches, no flags raised. By the time anyone asked, did something just change? The answer would already be yes. The political mechanism for this soft transition would likely bypass conventional annexation and focus. Instead, on the legal framework surrounding the existing defense treaties and status of forces agreements. Consider the situation in the 2020s. Climate change is rapidly transforming the Arctic. The melting ice opens new shipping lanes, exposes vast mineral wealth, and introduces new military theaters of operation. Greenland is no longer just a defensive asset. It is an economic prize. For the United States, securing control means locking down access to these resources and, crucially, denying them to strategic rivals like China and Russia, both of whom have shown increasing interest in the region. The legal lever for the shift would revolve around a concept often termed security escalation, an undefined but credible threat to the existing bases, whether from a rogue state or, more likely, from the internal political instability of the Kingdom of Denmark itself, would provide the necessary pretext. In this scenario, Washington would leverage the existing 1951 agreement, which grants the U.S. the right to operate military facilities on the island. The change wouldn't be an invasion, but an amplification of existing security protocols. The language would be entirely defensive, in light of unprecedented geopolitical instability. The United States is temporarily extending the operational jurisdiction of Pacific space base to include the immediately adjacent coastal waters and airspace, ensuring the continued viability of North American missile defense. The Danes would protest, of course, but their military and economic dependence on the U.S. means their leverage would be minimal. Greenland's own government, while possessing significant autonomy, is ultimately reliant on the Danish state for its major defense and foreign policy backing. The primary diplomatic tool used by the U.S. would not be military might, but financial inducement and structural pressure. It would involve a massive, unsolicited investment package offered directly to Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, bypassing Copenhagen entirely. This aid package, framed as climate resilience and infrastructure enhancement, would dwarf the annual block grant provided by Denmark. The offer would be simple: economic independence in exchange for permanent strategic alignment. The carrot here would be so large it would represent a fundamental rewiring of the island's economic DNA. Simultaneously, the U.S. would initiate a sophisticated, yet entirely internal, modification of its own chain of command. The command structure governing Pacific and the supporting facilities would be quietly transferred from U.S. space force and elevated to the direct oversight of Northern Command, transforming the base from a long-range monitoring station into a forward operating headquarters. This organizational change, invisible to the public, would signal that the U.S. is preparing to treat Greenland as functionally equivalent to a non-contiguous domestic territory, similar to Puerto Rico or Guam. The slow, silent transformation would be nearly complete before the international community could even finish its first round of diplomatic protests. The final piece of the puzzle would be securing the political consent of the local population, not through a binding referendum, but through a carefully choreographed appeal to their deepest aspirations for self-determination and financial independence. The U.S. would essentially offer them the one thing Denmark has consistently denied them: the economic means to stand alone. They would promise that under American protection, true sovereignty. The moment Greenland's status shifts, something else shifts with it. The global balance of power. It's not a loud, explosive change. It's a quiet, tectonic one. Suddenly, the United States has a permanent, unshakable foothold in the Arctic, a region that, until now, was a contested frontier. Think about it. Russia has spent decades and immense resources building up its Arctic presence. Military bases, icebreakers, resource exploration. It was their northern flank, their strategic backyard. China, calling itself a Nearctic state, has been trying to wedge its way in, investing heavily in scientific missions and infrastructure projects, all part of its Polar Silk Road initiative. They saw the Arctic as the next great economic and strategic prize. And with one diplomatic maneuver, the United States leapfrogs them all. Not by building more ships or deploying more troops, but by integrating a territory. It's already aligned with the West. It's a checkmate move on the Arctic chessboard. The northern sea route, which Russia controls and China covets, now runs under the watchful eye of an expanded American security umbrella. Any shipping, commercial or military, has to account for this new reality. The strategic depth of Russia is compressed. China's ambitions are checked. And all of this happens without a single shot fired. It's the kind of geopolitical masterstroke that historians will study for centuries. But the ripple effects extend far beyond the high north. Let's talk about resources. Greenland is sitting on a treasure trove of rare earth minerals. These are the elements vital for modern technology: smartphones, electric vehicles, advanced defense systems, green energy, they all depend on them. Currently, the world is overwhelmingly dependent on China for its supply of these minerals, giving Beijing immense leverage. They can constrict the supply chain, drive up prices, and use it as a political weapon in trade disputes. It's a strategic vulnerability for the entire Western world. By securing Greenland, the United States and its allies gain access to a massive, stable, and friendly source of these critical materials. This isn't just an economic win, it's a matter of national security. It breaks the monopoly, decouples critical supply chains from a strategic rival. The entire global tech industry would breathe a collective sigh of relief. The power to control the 21st century's most important resources would be rebalanced, shifting away from Asia and back towards the Atlantic. This move isn't just about territory. It's about controlling the building blocks of the future. Now, let's zoom in on the military implications, because they are profound. We mentioned missile defense, but let's be more specific. The Thule Air Base in Greenland is already the U.S. military's northernmost installation, a critical node in its early warning system for ballistic missiles. With full integration, this facility and others like it could be expanded and hardened without the diplomatic hurdles of operating on foreign but-allied soil. Response times become shorter. The defensive shield becomes stronger. But it's also about offense, or more accurately, power projection. Submarine patrols, for instance. The Greenland-Iceland UK gap is a critical choke point for any naval force trying to break out from the Arctic into the Atlantic. By solidifying control over Greenland, the U.S. Navy can effectively lock down this gateway. Its nuclear submarines can operate with greater freedom and security in the Arctic Ocean, an area previously dominated by Russian subs. It creates a forward operating base that is practically unsinkable. From here, American air and sea power can reach across the pole and deep into Eurasia in hours, not days. The strategic calculus for any potential adversary changes overnight. The cost of any aggression rises exponentially. It's a fortress built not of concrete and steel, but of geography and diplomacy. Nothing dramatic would change. And that's exactly why it would work. The transition would be smooth because it's already happening informally. The U.S. doesn't need to land troops or issue declarations. Greenland is already deeply woven into the fabric of American strategies, specifically the defense of the North American continent. Thule Air Base, the Northern Early Warning Systems. The established communication channels, these aren't new. They're established infrastructure that simply become formalized under a new administrative umbrella. The global reaction would be fascinating precisely because of its muted nature. Imagine the headlines: not us invades, but Greenland formalizes defense pact. Or Danish assets transferred for economic stability. The language matters. This isn't empire building in the traditional sense. It's geopolitical housekeeping driven by existential environmental threats and economic realities. Russia's primary concern in the Arctic is access to the northern sea route and resource exploitation. A consolidated, stable, and strategically defended Greenland doesn't inherently block these goals. But it makes the environment more predictably, less contested by smaller actors. For Moscow, predictability often trumps chaos. They would issue strongly worded statements. Perhaps conduct a few strategic bomber flights near Alaska, but the response would stop there. Why? Because challenging the arrangement directly would mean confronting the combined might of NATO's largest member state over an island. That, geographically, is already isolated. The cost-benefit analysis simply doesn't favor escalation. China's calculation is even colder. Their interest in Greenland is purely economic and scientific. Rare earth minerals, deep sea exploration rights, and potentially Arctic shipping routes via the Northwest Passage. If the U.S. formalizes control, the opportunity for China to gain independent access through bilateral deals with a struggling, small government vanishes. But confrontation is equally nonsensical. Instead, China pivots. They shift investment focus elsewhere in the Arctic, perhaps Iceland, Norway, or even quietly increasing stakes in Russian infrastructure. The long game continues, uninterrupted, simply rerouted. This quiet acceptance, or perhaps quiet resignation from the major powers, is the linchpin of the strategy. The move works because it is strategically essential to America economically necessary for Greenland and insufficiently threatening to everyone else to warrant a global crisis. Now, let's turn our attention to the domestic front inside the United States. While the international community yawns, the bureaucratic and political machinery in Washington, D.C. would begin to grind. The acquisition, however benevolent, presents enormous challenges that far outreach the strategic benefits. First, the cost. Acquiring a nation, even a sparsely populated one, is prohibitively expensive. The initial outlay to Denmark is only the beginning. The U.S. would inherit the entirety of Greenland's public debt, existing infrastructure maintenance, which is colossal given the climate and the responsibility for transitioning the economic structure from a heavy reliance on subsidies to self-sustainability, or at least integration into the American federal system. Estimates suggest the immediate cost of infrastructure stabilization, climate mitigation, and integrating social services could run into the tens of billions of dollars over the first decade. Congress would have to approve a massive appropriation, leading to predictable political infighting. Second, the political status of the territory. Would Greenland become a territory similar to Puerto Rico? Would it be granted expedited statehood despite its tiny population? The people of Greenland, the Kallalit, would retain their cultural identity, but their political future would be tied to the complicated, often messy, processes of the American federal government. Questions of voting rights, representation in Congress, and the applicability of U.S. law, especially environmental and resource regulations, would dominate the debate for years. Third, and perhaps most importantly, is the human element. The Kallalit are distinct. Their culture, language, and way of life are intrinsically linked to the ice and the sea. Integration into the American system, even with the best intentions, risks cultural erosion and dependence. The U.S. government would face the immense challenge of providing modern amenities and economic stability without destroying the very identity of the population it is trying to help. This isn't just about military bases. It's about people, history, and profound cultural responsibilities. The historical precedent here is not the Louisiana Purchase, but rather the American experience with its own indigenous populations. The potential for paternalism, for misunderstanding, and for imposing external values is high. Success wouldn't be measured in mineral wealth or missile defense, but in the long-term well-being and self-determination of the Greenlandic people. This is where the quiet ending truly becomes the complicated beginning, Greenland's own choice. At some point, Greenland would be asked a question, not publicly, not urgently, but quietly. Do you want stability or uncertainty? Protection or exposure? Choices made under calm are rarely reversed. The quiet end of the scenario. So what if America ever moved on Greenland? The honest answer is simple. The move would not feel like a move. There would be no day to remember, no anniversary, no moment of shock. Because the most decisive actions are the ones that feel inevitable by the time they are noticed. Some changes arrive with noise. Some arrive with force. And some arrive so quietly that history only realizes they happened after there is nothing left to debate. The history of great powers interacting with smaller nations often follows this pattern. A slow, gentle accretion of interests, influence, and infrastructure until the lines blur completely. It's not about invasion, it's about integration. In the case of Greenland, the strategic reality of the Arctic, coupled with the profound impact of climate change, guarantees global attention. The ice melting isn't just opening up new shipping lanes and access to valuable minerals. It's revealing the island as the physical choke point of the North Atlantic. For the United States, maintaining absolute control over the Thule Air Base and the surrounding airspace is a necessity that transcends political parties or specific administrations. It is a permanent fixture of national defense strategy, positioned to counter any threats coming over the North Pole. But the American presence is not merely a military one. It is also an economic anchor. Despite the growing push for self-sufficiency, Greenland's transition toward true independence from Denmark is staggeringly complex. Its small population of 56,000 relies heavily on fishing, tourism, and most critically, the massive annual block grant from Copenhagen. Full sovereignty demands a sustainable, diversified economy, which, at present, does not fully exist. This is where the quiet choices come into play. If Greenland seeks to finance its transition and build the infrastructure required for independence, it needs investment. And today, the most reliable long-term investors are also geopolitical players. When Nuuk weighs a choice between substantial, long-term American investment in ports, infrastructure, and mining operations, all supported by a security guarantee versus the uncertainty of navigating great power competition alone, the decision practically makes itself. The future of Greenland may not be determined by a declaration of war or a sudden political revolution, but by the steady accumulation of treaties, contracts, and defense agreements. When American capital flows in to build the deepwater ports needed for critical mineral exports, or when the U.S. Coast Guard becomes the de facto security provider for the Dieskau Bay Area, the scenario isn't one of annexation. It is one of irreversible strategic alignment. The ultimate conclusion of this long historical dance between Denmark, Greenland, and the United States is that geography always wins. Greenland's location dictates its fate, turning it into a silent, essential cornerstone of Western defense architecture. The strategic value is simply too high for any vacuum to be allowed to form. The question is not whether Greenland will be integrated into a larger geopolitical sphere, but merely which sphere it quietly settles into. And today, as the ice recedes and the global competition heats up, Greenland's choice of stable partnership over precarious independence has already begun to be written into the bedrock of its future. The most powerful historical shifts are often those you never saw coming, because they were happening all along beneath the surface. To explore the deeper currents that shape global history and to understand how these quiet agreements define the modern world, consider subscribing to our channel for more in-depth historical analysis.